Hello everybody, my name is Manuels and welcome to another Eternal Top Decks video series. It has been a while since I revisited Rakano Aggro. It has been the very first deck that I talked about and recorded, and so I found it fitting that it's also gonna be the first deck to receive a V4 video, especially given that recently it has become quite prominent and dominant again on ladder, has been doing really well, and it also has been doing really well for me again since I tried it again like the last 1 or 2 days. And yeah, I have my own opinion as usual on how I think the deck should be built and looks best, and I'm going to share that with you today again. So basically we are back to the roots a lot with this build. Also, that's like another nice thing in terms of like coming full circle. This list is very close to the initial list in my very first video. And that to some extent has to do with a lot of the metagame actually being kind of similar to back then as well. Alright, so let's go over the list. Basically, in terms of units, we have 26 units. The 8 like typical 1-drops if you only run 8. Pyroknight still is the best additional 1-drop in my opinion. Still don't agree that stuff like Fearless Nomad is worthy a full 1-drop slot, since most of the time you just can't play it on turn 1, and that's what I want. I want to go 1, 2, 3 in as many cases as possible. Use my power optimally and generate as much presence and tempo as I can. So yeah, the 8 1-drops. Most people currently in the mirror running for Oni Ronin of like Unearthly's recent list, but having more 1-drops is good in the mirror because having more board early is exactly one way to get an advantage by getting ahead on board on tempo, because a lot of the time stuff is going to trade or threatening to trade, and then having more stuff so that you end up with at least 1 unit in play while the opponent has 0 is a really good place to be. And next off we have the 2-drops, still for Champion of Glory and for Outlaw. Nothing has changed with them, they're still great. But one thing has changed here. I agree to some point with the fact by now that Inca Overseer is probably better than Groundwatch Paladin, simply because the 1 health is quite a big problem, and Rakano is just not that good at mitigating that low health the turn after. Like, for example, in Unearthly's list, he has Shogun Scepter, but he still doesn't run Crown Watch because Shogun Scepter only adds 1 health, putting the Paladin at 2 and still dying to most things. So yeah, Overseer is nice, the evasion is pretty good occasionally because it is like flying is like the next best thing after Overwhelm, I would say. For Rakano, Overwhelm is still a bit better because against a Titan, for example, that you can't handle, the flying is irrelevant and so on, and Overwhelm is just like the safest way of avoiding jump blocking, and jump blocking is usually the most threatening thing because actual blocking often isn't possible against your big. The other nice thing is that the relic interaction makes a 2-power 3/3 a reasonable amount of the time, since we run for Sword of Icaria again, like in the beginning, but I'll get to that in a moment. But yeah, with the Sword of Icaria, you can probably see this as like a 2.5 unit rather than like 2.2. So it has definitely like above average stats, and like probably the best stats of a 2-drop after, say, Champion of Glory, Awakened Student, Argenport Instigator. And that's pretty good together with the flying. And if you ever draw like 2 Swords of Icaria, for example, comes amazing. And he has been playing pretty well. Also because there's a reasonable amount of situations in decks that are vulnerable flyers, and having this and jamming like Hammer of Might on it on 4 is pretty sweet. One thing is noteworthy though, the loss of Crownwatch Paladin makes the deck more susceptible to sweepers, a bit more susceptible to cards like Lightning Storm and especially Harsh Roll. So that's something to keep in mind. Next off, I'm running 2 Ijin, simply because otherwise 24 units just a little light. I had that in the past, and in the past I was running Crownwatch Paladins in my very first video over this, but first of all I found Ijin to just be more powerful. The card is slower than Crownwatch, which can be a problem, but the card also can single-handedly win. Like Ijin plus any random unit can easily win the game on its own unanswered. And there's not that many answers to that sort of stuff, like especially in a deck that applies a lot of pressure, so there's a lot of units that already eat early answers from the opponent, and if you then manage to stick like a unit and an Ijin, they can just win the game for you when the opponent is out of answers. Which is very impressive. And like a 3-2 for 3 isn't terrible either. It's a bit fragile with the 2 healths, especially against Lightning Storm once again, but all in all the card I think is pretty powerful. And I mean, I would consider splitting it with Crownwatch or even play Crownwatch over it, but the problem is, now that we have Tinker Overseer over Crownwatch Paladin, the Crownwatch Cavalry gets a lot worse because we're losing like 4 early Warcry generators. And a naked cavalry without any Warcries on it is just not very impressive. Like maybe a 1-1 split is still okayish, but I'm pretty sure I wouldn't want 2 Crownwatch cavalries anymore with the Paladins. Then we have 4 Valkyrie Enforcer, also super standard, also super great. Not much to discuss here. A flyer, a silence, good stats, just everything a deck like this wants basically. So a quick note on the units that I'm not running. Basically, Silverwing Familiar. First of all, I think Familiar is fairly bad in the mirror. It costs you a lot of tempo. You play it for like 3 on turn 3, it has 0 board impact the turn you play it, and you also need like a weapon to make it relevant enough. And there's also like a bunch of good ways to interact with it. That also brings me to Sword of Icaria. That's part of why I run Sword. Sword is amazing against the people running Silverwing Familiar, and it's generally pretty good in the mirror. First of all, it is, while it's not the most tempo efficient answer, it's still additional removal for a lot of the units of the 2 and 3 drops. So being able to interact with the opponent's board is really good, because you want to keep their board as small as possible. If you can keep them on 0 units and never let them get to their turn with a unit in play, then their weapons become a lot worse, and that also generates a lot of tempo and strands a lot of cards in your opponent's hand temporarily. And if you ever get Warcry triggers on a Sword of Icaria, that's a big deal. Like a 4-3 sword kills 1-drops and like Overseer and Outlaw and Familiar without dying, so it turns into a 2-for-1. And if you ever hit it with multiple Warcry triggers or a Hammer of Might trigger, then the card can easily dominate a game, protected by other units. It also has, as already mentioned, really nice synergy with Overseer. And having 1 relic for the Overseer makes him that much better. And let me just tell you, I hate Paladin Oathbook. I think the card is really bad. It forces you into very awkward play patterns. It's a 2-drop that has no real board impact. Basically, imagine you go like Oni Ronin into Oathbook, attack just for your opponent, like torch your 1-drop or block your 1-drop with their 1-drop, and then you spend your turn 2 doing nothing relevant in an aggressive deck, and then you're so far behind because the opponent plays an actual 2-drop. And then you play like a 3-drop. They play like a 3-drop with their Oathbook, and then you on turn 3 play another unit or a Sword of Icaria or some other removal on that unit, and then they still have wasted their entire turn 2. It just takes them so long to get use out of that Oathbook. And also imagine scenarios where you have multiple units and an Oathbook. Then you have the choice between making your Oathbook useless and ignoring it, or making all but one unit sort of useless because you can only attack with one unit to get value out of Oathbook, and in a lot of scenarios that will be a rock and a hard place and both decisions will suck. Which is why I think in most cases, in most decks, Paladin's Oathbook is an unplayable card, especially in a low to the ground aggressive deck with such a low curve that wants to drop like multiple units early and fast. I just don't think the card is good. And fortunately enough, there's another solid relic to go along with Tinker Overseer, which also happens to be a lot better in the mirror than Oathbook. So yeah, this list is slightly slanted towards the mirror, but it has been doing like really great for me in general. I actually just gave this list a test run earlier and jammed it for like 20 games, and I went 15-5 with the deck. So and actually mostly I think almost only played against like non-mirrors, so the list did not do poorly at all outside of the mirror and should do better in a mirror than the other list. I'm pretty happy with that. And yeah, and then we have like the combat tricks / cheap interaction cards, Finest Hour and Torch. I mean, Torch doesn't need much explanation. Finest Hour shouldn't need much explanation, but Unearthly's current list that a lot of people running does not run Finest Hour, and I think that's just very questionable, simply because I think the card just does a lot of for you. It can generate so much tempo. It's a very flexible solution to units standing in your way. It counters various removal like Suffocate, Torch, Lightning Storm, and so on. There's just a lot of things that Finest Hour can do. And at worst, it still just deals 3 additional damage on an unblocked unit, finishing off an opponent, for example, giving the deck a lot more sort of burst potential. Finest Hour and Torch. Then we have the 3 Vanquish, also very typical. Need answers to big stuff like Weapon Up and Warcry units in the mirror, Sandstorm Titans and all that stuff. Just the best, arguably the best or one of the best removal in the game. Still only 3 because getting flooded with those can really hamper our development. So you want to see one often enough, but you don't want to see multiples of the time and have them stranded in your hand in the wrong situation, because we have other ways of dealing with bigger units like Finest Hour and weapons on a unit, or just flying over them if they don't have flying, or even Ijin and Emerald Mon. And yeah, then we just have the weapons for Hammer of Might, also very standard. I would not leave the house without 4 Hammer of Might in my Rakano deck. I've seen versions of Unearthly with only 3, but I'm just not a fan of that. I think the card is just one of the makers of this deck, basically. So I think it's an absolute 4 off. And then 2 Deepforged Blade, simply because I don't like having too many expensive cards that can rot in my hand and gum up my hand. And I think also if you run more than 2 5-drops, you probably need the 29th power. So basically it's like 2 slots for 1 blade and 1 power. For example, I'd rather have the 25th and 26th unit than another blade power, because what's the blade worth if I don't have a unit in play, for example? And the power base is still the same as it always has been, basically 28, with an even distribution, with 2 justice sources, Emerald Monument. Still a pretty big fan of like only 2 Monument. More than that usually slows you down too much, especially with cards like Ijin as additional power, I think. Without Ijin, maybe you can try to run 3 monuments, but I found at a certain point too many monuments end up being played as power sources too often, so often that they are more often depleted power than a gem blade, and then you're suddenly putting sort of bad cards in your deck. And at that point it's better to just have a Sigil that's undepleted justice rather than depleted justice, when more often than not Monument ends up as power and slows you down early, rather than ends up as an actual template. And yeah, I think that's it. Pyroknight still is a little worse in the sense that we have a little less Warcry, so it sometimes is a little smaller in the mid game, but fortunately enough it still has the ultimate in the deck. Gets to 6 a reasonable amount of the time from just like flooding out a bit, and then having the Pyroknight to ultimate is really good, and the Overwhelm still makes for a pretty good Hammer of Might target, for example, and Warcry trigger target, and even Mithril Armor from Ijin. And yeah, the Sword of Icaria. Bring back some Warcry, since in the past there have been lists without Sword of Icaria but with Groundwatch, so basically losing Groundwatch but regaining Sword of Icaria sort of evens out the Warcry there. But it's still 4 Warcry less than in the list in the very beginning where we had Groundwatch, Sword of Icaria. So yeah, that's it for the decklist. As usual, I'm gonna hop into some more games to show it in action, show you some more of that spicy 15-5 performance, hopefully. And yeah, so thanks for watching and stay tuned for the first half of the games coming up in a moment.